Good evening, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here. I've just arrived from Abidjanow yesterday, and really reconnecting with Leslie is always a pleasure. This has happened a few times in the past 10 years, and today I would like to share with you what my experience has been as an architect in Côte d'Ivoire. Not only in Côte d'Ivoire as a way of practice, but generally in Africa, on the continent. And because we tend to share similar issues across the continent. Sometimes they vary, but I think the root of those issues is pretty much the same. So I will start talking a little bit about context. The context I work in is, to me, very specific because it is what actually creates the architecture that we at Koffi Diabaté make. And this is an image of Abidjan. It's what's interesting about this picture is the fact that right now, today in 2019, this is the way the city expands. It definitely was not the way before. In the 60s was much more planned and orchestrated, but now it's become something of a mushroom that we cannot really control. And one of the reasons for that is the demographic growth. And as you probably know, in most African cities, we're feeling the pressure of demographic, and the urban population specifically is rising exponentially. And for me, as much as this growth is often seen as a problem, for me it's very much of an opportunity. It's an opportunity because we have a young population that can actually change things on a massive scale and in very little time. And of course, the first effect of that is this sort of informality. And by informal, of course, we often see something that is not totally mastered, but a rapid growth has a tendency to exacerbate this informality, especially in the urban context. And governance, as of today, has had a hard time understanding what is going on. This is quite unprecedented. I don't think that there's already any ways to think about or even work on this sort of informality at this time. I think it's very specific to our times. Massive growth and the informal. So this also means that the informal nature of our environments in which we practice should allow for much flexibility in the long run. It's, of course, easier to incorporate notions of sustainability in our practice of architecture, and certainly less costly than it would be for more formal settings. I'm just trying to say that if you try to work on heating solutions in Paris, of course you will spend lots of money trying to sort of reconfigure those systems into systems that are totally sustainable. And that is a problem we do not have in... Okay. Can you hear me better? Okay. So, like I was saying, this also means that the informal nature of our environments, the environments in which we practice, allow for much flexibility, and it's much easier to incorporate notions of sustainability in our practice of architecture, and certainly less costly than it would be in more formal environments. And of course, this is an opportunity to step into the global. What can we bring to the global platform as architects, as thinkers of this continent? And if informality becomes opportunity, then there are many things that can happen on the continent, and the impact can be quite strong. So the lecture today will be sort of split in two. The first part is really about the challenges that we have, and the second part will be just a few examples of how we at Koffi Diabaté have tried to work with those challenges. So, okay. think I'm gonna use the... Okay. So, how do we approach architecture? For me, it is very important to start with an idea, to start with thinking. And to me, the idea is certainly at the root of the process. And one starts from totally ethereal to something that becomes totally material. And this process is nourished in the process by intellectual and academic material. So we need to do research, we need to do thinking, we need to pretty much get close to sociology to understand really environments that we work in. And traditionally, the school has been the environment that best fosters this type of thinking. And it is important that we start from the very beginning, from school, to understand the environment that we do work in. Do we need to build the next skyscraper, or do we need to do architecture that actually changes humanity in general, not only in Africa, but everywhere? So, of course, architects need to engage in intellectual content, and they need to encourage research, they need to produce academic material, and they also need to create a work that works on a network, knowledge that can actually touch other people, beyond architecture, the general public, of course, and of course the people in charge of our policies. But of course, when we move from the idea, we go into designing. And what's amazing about design is that we've been used to work from very different trades, very different domains. I mean, from sociology to engineering to economics. And I think that we as architects can really rely on those ability to sort of tap into different domains to come up with an idea. And in the process, totally get free ourselves of all the constraints that we usually have when we go about design. And we need to start from the idea to sort of drop those barriers and really think openly and not restrain ourselves to the traditional practice of architecture. And in the process, of course, we deal today with a matter that's quite important, which is sustainability. And for me, sustainability is a precept that one must leave the planet with an added value when they leave the planet. So it is true that for nature, we need to do that, but it is also true for technology, and it's also true for less tangible notions, such as quality of life, for instance. How do we create an architecture that really changes the life of people? So African architects must restore and promote this sort of local philosophy of architecture, and I think that it is pretty much, it's a lot easier for us to do that than for more formal environments. And our approach can be illustrated by the idea that what makes a forest sacred is its condition as a reservoir of natural substances that cure sicknesses, improve our well-being, and not because they hold some sort of mystical power. So if we sort of go back to that type of thinking, we can change a lot of things in the world of architecture and really improve our well-being. So from sustainability, we will retain the notion that we have to translate that into practice. And of course, practice is very open and very wide when you're an architect. And it expresses the passage from thought to physical. And in the process, what becomes physical doesn't necessarily mean a building. It certainly is, it could be an essay, it could be books. It is the results of the thinking process, and how do we use that result into our practice. And as architects, as you probably know, our practice is very varied. It goes from being a sociologist to an urbanist to an economist to a drawer, and it's really all of those things put together that really makes us architects. And I think that this is the time to sort of reclaim that space as people who are trained to think about many things at the same time in order to design. So we should not limit ourselves to designing buildings, but we should pretty much open ourselves to designing the environments that we live in, including social environments, political environments, and what have you. So the minute we stop thinking of ourselves as technicians, we can pretty much tap into all those domains and feel totally at ease. So what is coming next? I think in this context, what is most important is the fact that today we're in a world that is totally connected. And of course, if you are connected, you can tap in the local as well as the international and whatever is far at the same time. And it is a possibility to start to explore other routes. I was at Design Indaba not too long ago and was happy to see that presentation about this American company using drones to deliver blood to villages that are not reachable by road. And what's amazing about that is this is only possible in Rwanda because they don't have as airspace regulation is not as tight as it would be in Los Angeles. This was never happened in the States where it was developed, but Africa has become now a territory where this can be explored. And if we start thinking about many of our issues in the same way, for instance, if we think about education, how could we improve our school system? It's not really about building schools and putting teachers there. I mean, we need to start to think differently about all those things. And of course, in the process, we also need to become an inspiration for the rest of the world. That is something that we are not so conscious about, but the fact that we can explore those technologies on a different scale, in a different environment, can actually bring solutions to problems that are also present in the rest of the world. So this is for the introduction. And I will now move to what we do and how we've sort of tried to carry this type of thinking into what we do. So we're an office of about 50 people, Koffi and Diabaté. This is myself and my partner. We've been working since 1995. And of course, initially, that was not, I mean, what I'm talking about was not at the root of our process, but it sort of imposed itself with time and with the issues we were confronted with. We initially worked for private clients, and in the process realized that if our practice did not evolve, we would just be one other architect. And for us, it was really important that after our practice, things would have to change and people would think about architecture differently. So we sort of invited ourselves into the debate. And of course, I'm going to show you two different ways in which we deal with our environment. And the first one is, rather formal, rather corporate. And the second one is a little bit more about our own exploration and what we think is a solution for the architect of tomorrow. So context. Context here, I'm going to talk about physical context. I mean, we are in West Africa, tropical climate, as you can see, Ivory Coast, a place where it's always warm, very humid. And of course, we have to take that into architecture. And Abidjan is the place where we operate from. But a few years ago, we decided that it was important for us to sort of test other issues about architecture, maybe related, directly related to the climate, but also related to the social environment. And in order to do that easily, we decided to do it in a place called Assini Mafia, which is a village, actually. A village where we didn't have to comply with all of the constraints that you do have in urban environments. And it started initially with this church. And this church was really interesting for us because it was the opportunity to use the community for building something, and not as manpower, but also as economic power, as people that could provide materials, people who donated to the architecture like ourselves. It took about 3-4 years to build, but it was an interesting example for us as a typology, as we could explore ways to naturally ventilate it. If you see the openings on the two sides, taking the flow of air and with the chimney effect, evacuates it at the top. So we kept on playing with those principles, for instance here with residential, where you see that we are using a ventilated roof So cross ventilation is allowing the air to go through on top of the ceiling. So you have this sort of blade of air that goes in between the ceiling and the roof that avoids the heat to directly go into the internal spaces. So you can really achieve a big difference in terms of temperature and feeling. And of course, when you start playing, you keep on playing, and we tested mud walls and openings that are not necessarily usual in that configuration, and also bamboo for cross ventilation. As you can see, the air can go through, but the bamboo screen sort of brings some sort of privacy to the house. Here you can see the big overhang sort of protecting the terrace, which actually is the main living space in our part of the world, with this huge roof that allows all the spaces to be kept in the shade and make them quite comfortable. So after testing all of those things, we thought it was important to maybe carry that into our more formal practice of architecture. And I'm going to show you a few projects that have been designed that way. This is the Basilica Our Lady of Peace, which is our own basilica in Ivory Coast. It's pretty much a copy of St. Peter's of Rome. I think one is wider and the other is taller, I don't know which. And we were asked by the clergy to design a retreat center for people who would come to the basilica and who wanted to retreat, or people who had people staying in the hospital next door and wanted to sort of be in a place where they could recollect. And of course, when you look at this, the site, you see that there's pretty much not much but the basilica, and the rest is a sort of this big unclaimed land. And since we had the choice to decide where we wanted to build this this complex, we chose this part, which is close to the water and already has somewhat of a forest action going on here, because we wanted to be in total contrast with this building, which is quite big and strong and quite present. And we sort of decided to disappear in this area, the forest that is here, by building a network of buildings that are mainly designed to house the people staying there, but also with a chapel and a cafeteria and other support activities. So here you can see the basilica where it sits. It has a sort of a dirt road on the back that leads to the site, and this is pretty much what the site looks like. Here you can see we're pretty much sitting in the forest. There is a main space and that sort of distributes the rest of the other spaces, which are mainly residential for the people who come. But also we have a small conference center, a chapel, and a restaurant, and a big body of water here to sort of bring serenity to the place. Here you have an image of what it looks like. We have relied on the principles that we developed in SNE Mafia to build this extensive network of roofs and open circulation that relates all the different buildings. Here is another view with the entrance happening here, the main space, and all of the different functions. Relating to the lake behind. I don't know if you could see the lake on the big picture. That's an image of the entry. So we're relying pretty much on the similar principles that we've developed in the village to provide very open and very ventilated space. This is a plan of one of the buildings with the bedrooms. The outer circulation is protected with bamboo structure, and the one facing the balconies is made out of red bricks. Here is the main space where you enter. Everything is kept quite simple. Of course, we have to also worry about economy of means, And in terms of materials, we tend to rely on whatever is accessible and whatever makes sense in terms of our geography, in terms of our economy. So it's concrete is still the cheapest, and a corrugated roof structure with wooden beams, and that allows for cross ventilation to happen, and also this big pound of water to sort of bring a little bit of freshness in the entire compound. Here's an image of central space and chapel here on the water and the bedrooms. We thought it was really important to use water, and because of course if you're coming for recollection, water tends to be very practical that way. Here you have an image of the chapel from the outside that is just facing the pond, and from the inside where you're surrounded with earth walls and facing the lake and the pond in the front. Also, here we're using earth walls because we're in part of Ivory Coast that's slightly different from the first one I showed, where we rely a little bit more on insulation than cross ventilation. And, you know, so the earth walls allow us to do that. You can see here some of the bedrooms facing the courtyards. We also thought it was important to create screens because if you want to recollect, you don't necessarily want to be out in the balcony, you know, facing the other buildings. And we've used those brick walls, you know, perforated. You could still see through, but keep your privacy. If you another image of the building in general. So from that project, I'm moving to another one, which is totally different in terms of not only scale but philosophy. We just, well, a few years ago, about 4 years ago, we won a competition to design the Orange headquarters building in Abidjanow, and that was a bit challenging for us because the site is in this area on the lagoon. There is a main bridge here that links the two major parts of town, and what you see here is the Gulf of Abidjanow, and our plot is right here. So how do you build a building, office building, you know, next to the Gulf of Abidjanow without being intrusive? And we thought it was important for us to sort of take the greenery from the Gulf and sort of make it come into our site. So our building sits here, but as you can see here, all of this is sort of a green space with similar trees as the one we have on the golf course. There's a main road that goes here. The area is mainly residential, and this is also another reason why we wanted it to be quite low-key. The principle of the building is quite simple. It's just a central circulation space that distributes all the working space, and we turned it into the O of Orange to make it site-specific. And as you can see here, the main road is here, and this is the Gulf. And we thought it was really important to get some of that green energy as well here, and sort of step the building up as we go towards the lagoon. So the impact should be quite low on the road. Of course, in the middle of the O, we have an atrium that brings in light, but also brings a lot of greenery. We tend to use a lot of greenery to also shade our buildings because it's quite free. We're in tropical climate, and it's beautiful. We might as well. It changes the energy. This is an image of the building from the road. You have a big glass wall that sort of protects the building. This is the building that has a sort of an outer shell that looks a little bit like a golf ball. And we're using that outer shell to actually protect the building from direct sun rays. It's creating a ventilated facade with very classic curtain wall behind, and this sort of double skin that protects it from the tropical sun. Here is another image. Here you can maybe see a little bit better how the greenery steps into the building and how the golf ball sorts of disappears in the back next to the lagoon. Another image, public space here, and the lagoon in the back. So this is actually currently under construction. We should be done in the middle of next year, and yes, and be ready to move on to something else. An image from the lagoon. Now I'm going to move to another project, which we were very lucky to win the WAF sports category in 2018, last year, which is a gymnasium, and which really illustrates pretty much what we do on a daily basis. Of course, working for Orange is quite exceptional, and working with budgets where you can actually have a second skin as sophisticated as this one don't come every day. So this is a gymnasium that we completed for the French International School of Abidjanow. They wanted to have, they needed to expand their sports facility, and had a program of two big rooms and 2 big rooms for table tennis and gymnastics, and a huge gymnasium for multi activity and multi sports. And of course, working in a tropical environment for us was really important in terms of what kind of building we would produce, and always feel connected to what our climate is about. So what we did here was something very simple. We started with a very classic structure of columns and beams at the ground, those spanning about 18 meters, sorry, and with another 6 meters for the periphery. So after that, we added the floor with then the other spaces. We have the table tennis room here, and the gymnastics room. And around those 2 rooms, we've put all the locker rooms. And if you look properly, you'll see that all the walls don't go up to the slab, and this is for cross-ventilation purposes. The skin that sort of isolates the room is made out of perforated metal, so that we can achieve cross-ventilation at all times. Here you see the platform, which is the slab of the lower spaces, used for multi-purpose activity, and different types of sports. On top of that, we just put a metal structure that spans 36 meters for the room, but also has an overhang of about 6 meters on each side, so that it can protect the internal spaces from rain and sun. This is the outer skin, the roof, and in the middle you can see that sort of double roof action in order to take the air from the sides and sort of pull it in to the middle for chimney effect. And we're also using this for light. Here is the outer skin, and here you can see how the building is pretty much composed. This section is probably the most important feature about this building, as you can see here how it sort of protects the internal spaces from the element, from the rain. Tropical climate rains a lot. Also from the sun, as it can get pretty sunny, and sort of outer skin here, which is perforated, allows for less sun to go inside, and of course, cross ventilation being key, we made sure that we cross ventilated both spaces, and the upper spaces are ventilated through perforated metal sheeting, and the lower spaces are just ventilated by not making the walls go up all the way up. This is an image of what you see when you're inside the venue. And what I think is interesting is that we have total transparency on the surrounding. So when you're inside, the building completely disappears, and when you're outside is when you can rid the skin of the building. So even the red roof that you see, which is totally perforated, totally disappears when you're inside. And you can very much feel the link with the spaces outside. And of course, we used the central ventilation shaft also to bring a little bit of light, and have used transparent roofing to also bring a little bit more light in the space. The space is very flexible. All of these equipment can be moved and removed. And here's the climbing wall. These are the below spaces, table tennis, which also rely on perforated metal to sort of isolate the space. If you're playing, you don't want your balls to be running around. So this has been, this material has been actually very good in terms of playing with internal and out, inside and outside spaces. And of course, having not much money to do a building like that, it was important that we didn't hide anything, that everything that went into the building went at it as it is. So if you have the stairs, they're all concrete. If you look at the roof, nothing is hidden. It's just very basic. I mean, you can even see them. I don't know if you see them here, but you can see the gutters running along the building. And we didn't think that was actually taking away from the beauty of the building, and it actually participated in the fact that we're using, gravels and local plants to just not spend a lot of money into sophisticated things. This is the ramp that connects the rest of the school to the upper space. A view from the playing fields onto the building, and a general view of the building. So this is for the part of architecture that we in the office think of as being quite classic. But of course, in order to be able to do the things that I've talked about in the first place, which is to sort of empower yourself as an architect and sort of become the one who is the owner of the idea from the beginning all the way to the end, we had to sort of transform ourselves into developers. And that didn't come as an easy decision. It even came without us knowing that we were becoming developers. The first project that we did was is this one, which is called Immeuble Carbone. We have our office next door, and when we moved to this space, we felt it would be quite good to have to own a building next door, so we could compensate for the low times in architecture. As we know, we often have low times. So we built this thing, and exactly when it was finished is the time when we thought one building as a developer was not significant enough, and that we needed to have more impact on the city and actually be more vocal about what we thought should be good for our city, and addressing issues that architects usually think are major for architecture. Such as if you're talking about urban setting, things like density, urban sprawl, mobility. These are things that we wanted to address, and this building, of course, could not talk about all those things. So we sold it after it was finished, and we went on to do this project called Résidence Chocolat, which is 32 units on 11,000 square meters in a neighborhood that usually have one house for 2,000 square meters. And here the challenge was to sort of prepare the public for what is coming next. And of course, in a city like Abidjan, cities that move from 1 million to 6 million in less than 40 years, issues of density are becoming key. So we thought it would be interesting to actually put the upper segment of society into something quite dense. So the challenge here was to make people buy those units, and people who usually would buy bigger houses to come here. And when we were doing it and we showed it to some of our friends, they thought we were completely crazy. They said, well, you will never achieve it. I mean, this will be too expensive, and people who pay that kind of money don't want to live in that kind of space. But we felt that, you know, beyond the issue of square meters and the issue of even the unit was the issue of lifestyle. Here we have developed a parking space underneath the central space. Why? Because we didn't want to have any cars running around in the compound. And by taking the cars downstairs underneath, we created all those open gardens that relate to the parking space, so we have a constantly ventilated parking space. This space in the middle has become the common space for all 32 units. And today, what's really interesting about it is that the owners have sort of reclaimed the space and have their little drinks of the month, you know, on this space. We also thought that this was going to be inhabited by a younger population, but the people who live here, a lot of them have owned bigger houses before and sold them to move here. Why? Because they feel that a lot of their worries are taken care of. There's just one generator for everybody in case there's power outage. Security, gardening, all of that is common. And actually the fact that we've been able to mutualize all those things have really had an impact on the kind of money they spend at the end of the month to maintain the property. We thought it was important to put people back in living configurations where they would share again with their neighbor, where they would have direct contact, you know, from one door to the next. And also, in the process, sort of develop another type of lifestyle. But of course, we would have never been able to do this if we had to work with clients or developers. Or, so what we did, we started from our idea, and once we had the idea, sorry, I think this is going too fast. Yeah. Once we had the idea, of course, for us, the question was how to finance it. And we went to the bank as we would, as architects, and the banks were like, well, we know you as architects, but we don't know you as developers. So how can you do this? So we were like, okay, well, deal, finance half of it, and we can make sure that we will sell all of it, you know, before we're even halfway. And they were like, okay, we'll take the risk with you, which we did. And before we even finished, you know, all the units were sold. And that's probably because we were thinking more in terms of lifestyle and solutions for the end user, than in terms of unit as a house or designed house. So this was quite a success for us. And moving from financing, we also thought it would be key to build it ourselves. So how did we do it? We sort of federated a bunch of small companies, local small companies, and tried to supervise them into building this thing, because we wanted to be the ones to decide what type of material and how expensive we wanted we wanted to be the final ones to decide on what material and whether it was too expensive or not, because we wanted to achieve something very specific that we had in mind. So we ended up building it, and of course, if we didn't sell it, I don't think anybody else could have sold it. Of course, how do you sell something like that? You don't talk about square meters, you don't talk about surface, you talk mainly about lifestyle and how you can actually change people's lifestyle. But of course, 32 units in a city that needs 50,000 a year is just a drop in the ocean. So our next project that we're about to launch now is slightly bigger. Now we're dealing with 226 units. And of course, when you have the opportunity to work on a bigger scale, on a larger scale, you also have the opportunity to introduce other things. You can start playing now with demographics, with the type of population you would want to have there. And also, of course, that is totally directly related to the type of products that you're selling. So if you start with very modest units and with penthouses facing the lagoon, then you can make sure that you will end up with a quite varied population. And of course, sitting on this time on 3.3 hectares has allowed us to bring other things, beyond housing. We have an office building because we also think that the habits of people are changing, and instead of commuting hours, it could be quite pleasant to have your office here. We're on the lagoon, which is quite an advantage because we can also relate this part of the city with other parts of the city using the lagoon and using transportation, lagoon transportation, which is not yet extensively used in Ivory Coast, and that would definitely solve a major mobility problem from 20 minutes using the boat, versus an hour and a half using the car. Of course, issues that I talked about, such as cross ventilations, were really dear to us, and introduction of green spaces into those little patio gardens were really important for us. And also, we were able to introduce other type of activities, such as retail spaces. And here you can see one little street where we try to take the pavement away and replace it with a green floor. These are some of the stores that you can find on the road here. That's the office building. And that's the sports center with a gymnasium and swimming pool. All of that because we sort of believe that because of the urban sprawl that we're experimenting right now, and because of all the sort of very complex problematics that relate to the urban setting, our governments are not in a position where they can really anticipate not only the growth, but they do not have a vision for what needs to be built. And I personally believe that in order to find a solution for what is ahead of us, we need to go back to what we already have. What do we have? We have villages, and most of the time in West Africa, when you travel to villages, you will find that they're mostly clean. But once you reach the city, that becomes huge, becomes a metropolis of 6 million people. Governments do not have not only the vision but the means to even start to monitor and control that. So we need to come back to maybe models of governance that rely more and more on, like in the village, the chief. When you have a chief is connected to everybody in the village, everybody knows him, and everybody behaves accordingly. Strangely enough, this is something that I also found to be true in informal settings, like I like to call them spontaneous dwellings, mainly in our cities, where from the outside they look like total chaos, but the time that you move in, you realize that everything is taken care of because they have local chiefs, they have local women associations, they have young people associations, they do urban crops, they do compost, and they do all of that because government is actually not going in there. So if they don't, nobody will do it for them. And I think we need to sort of come back to similar scales of dwelling, and not only with projects like these, but even in projects that can be more ambitious. Like this one. I'm not going to have too many images about this one because this is really at the burgeoning process. We were approached by this village that is on the lagoon of Abidjan, and that is very soon to be reached by the city because the city is building roads to reach that place. And the villagers have realized that when you build a road, it doesn't bring development, but it also brings chaos. So they're a bit worried about what may happen to their little tiny village that is here. And they wanted to have an idea of how to structure the urban environment before the city actually reaches the village. There are lots of roads being built right now, but of course governments do build the roads, but they don't necessarily think about the fabric of what will of those villages and those urban settings. So you will find a lot of times that villages have been totally swallowed by the city, and they become totally unrecognizable. So here, what we did is we tried to discuss with the villagers what type of action we could do in order to not only stop but structure the village before the city comes to the village. And of course, we needed to have a vision, rely on a vision. What type of scale do we want for this dwelling? Do we want it to be totally linked to the big city, or should we rather create something that is quite at a human scale, but that also provides all the things that a city provides? So currently we're very much in discussion process. We know this is going to be a very long-term process. We think it's going to take 10 to 15 years, but we also think it is very exciting to actually engage in something like this because all of a sudden our actions as architects is no longer about building the next pretty thing, but becomes much more structural in the way a city develops. And this is pretty much what I wanted to share with you, share the fact that we as architects are very much empowered to do things, and the only thing that limits us is the way we think. I mean, we're already used to working with so many different trades that we can very much continue using that same type of design proficiency to design ecosystems. And it's not about having money. It's not about having political power. It's about your own will and your own imagination. Thank you very much.